Um, Good evening, everyone. A very
Good.
warm welcome to IIHS University. Thank you for joining us on this discussion on the book A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey by Professor Devesh Kapur and Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Tea and coffee are available outside in the cafeteria, and the washrooms are located to your right. We request you to keep your phones on silent for the duration of the event. We will have a Q&A session at the end. So when the floor is open, please wait for the microphone to be passed to you. For those who may need additional seating, the event is also being live streamed in the second floor classroom. And the publisher has also set up a bookstall for anyone who would like to purchase a copy. Today's session is being recorded and live streamed, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. So do follow our university on social media to stay connected with our future events. We are delighted to have two distinguished speakers with us this evening, Professor Devesh Kapur and Dr. Arvind Subramanian. To guide the conversation, we are joined by Aromar Revi, Vice Chancellor of IIHS University and a global practice and thought leader whose work spans sustainable development, urbanization, climate science, and disaster risk reduction. With that, it is my pleasure to hand over to Aro, who will introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Namita. Vijay, you might as well come in the front unless you're able to. So yeah, I guess people will come in. Bangalore is, not known for its traffic. So I guess some people will come in the front. So very glad to have Devesh and Arvind here. Arvind has spoken here a long time back when he was CA. So quick introductions. Arvind Subramanian was the Chief Economic Advisor in India at a very exciting point of time. And he's at the Peterson Institute, one of India's leading macroeconomists, was with the IMF and has taught in a number of universities, including Ashoka, Brown, etc. And Devesh is an old friend. He is the professor of South Asian Studies at SIAS at Johns Hopkins. He was earlier, those of us who sort of track the South Asian Studies business in the US, he was director of CASI. And he's one of India's leading experts both on the political economy and also higher education for many years. So this book has really been quite a effort and magisterial work in some senses. I'm still maybe halfway through. It's 600 pages, certainly worth looking at. And those of you who have the opportunity, if the authors are happy and willing to sign the thing, some of the books are at the back. So just very quickly, there'll be a few people coming in, but we'll start. We want to keep on time. ऐसा है कि इसमें मतलब 3 हिस्से होंगे. The first is that Devesh and Arvind will make a presentation. उसके बाद थोड़ी सी चर्चा होगी. And उसके बाद I really want to open up the house because we have हमारे यहाँ पे बहुत सारे students हैं from across the country. So we really want to open the discussion. I think they'll be very glad to do that. तो उसमें यह है कि अंग्रेजी में बात करेंगे, पर आप लोग जो है प्रश्न जो है हिंदी में, मराठी में, and then hopefully we can, if people need to do, you can do Tamil. You can, you can try. We have enough translators, I guess, in the faculty. We have a very multilingual set of students from across the country, so I'm sure they'll be glad to have us. And there'll be other people also online. So us samay we'll try and take the online folks first. So things are set up, Pratigna? Slides are done? Okay, great. So can we jump in and we can pick up stuff and do whatever it is? Yeah, keep the time. The discussion, I think, is more important. Do you want to run it from there, talk, whatever it is? You can do it from the lectern or you can sit and talk, whatever is good for you. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Aromar. Thank you all for being here. I especially want to thank Dr. Kelkar, who's here, who's been an inspiration for all of us for all these decades. So it's a real personal pleasure to see him here. So this book, just a brief background about the book. It's interdisciplinary, as you know. Arvind is an economist. I'm a political scientist, and I think we felt very strongly that when you think about economic development in a young country, uh, it doesn't have the luxury to think about development outside the other tasks that it has, which is state and nation building and also transforming society. These are necessarily concurrent, and therefore you have to look at economic development through a multidisciplinary lens. Just some broad features of the book. We were determined to begin this project without strong priors. And so we spend a lot of effort putting together data on a wide variety of variables. Uh, and so that the story that we tell is through the data rather than having a story and finding the data to support it. To put together that data, we spend years putting together and reading about 3,000 official government reports over the last 7 decades. And that's how we built the data sets, which then became the basis of writing this book. Uh, two other points, sort of broadly, about the book. One thing, we also did not want to look at the past through the lens of the present. It's very easy to be wise in hindsight. And so we wrote this book looking at what people were thinking and writing at the time when these challenges were arising. What was the lens? What were the challenges they were facing? Rather than what we call the condescension of posterity. Uh, the other feature of the book is that we, you can't sort of see India, its performance, independent of what's happening around the world. So there's a strong comparative feature of the book. We look at India, but also see in comparison to other large developing countries with a little more emphasis on China because it's the only other large giant. So with that, uh, I'll sort of, so the first slide is sort of, in a sense, sets the stage. If you look at sort of broad paths of economic development and political development, they're basically four stories. There is the Western story. The Western story is what you see on the x-axis is per capita income. On the y-axis is a measure of political development, in this case, the democracy. And what happens is in the West that as incomes grow, as per capita incomes grow, broadly speaking, what you see is that the the franchise begins to expand and the democracy grows. The second model is the East Asian model, epitomized by South Korea. And the Korean model is first economic development, followed by political development or the expansion of the democracy. The third model is China, strong economic development, but no to democracy. India, however, begins with universal franchise at extremely low levels of development. So just to show you this is a graph looking at what was the per capita income at full franchise and the gap between between female between full franchise and sort of male franchise. So what you see is that India gave full franchise at much lower levels of income than other countries. And second, there was no gap between male and female franchise. And the latter is particularly noteworthy given just how patriarchal Indian society was then. Not that it's not so now, but it was even more so at that point of time. So, what were the early fateful choices? And this, most of you are familiar with. Uh, in politics, the choice was universal adult franchise. Initially, especially after the violence of partition, there was a greater, it sort of veered towards greater centralization as regards religion. It was secularism, language, it allowed the diversity. On caste, it was the first country that gave affirmative action for marginalized groups. In fact, where we see affirmative action, countries like South Africa or Malaysia, it's given for the majority community. India was exception that it gave it to the minority, not the majority. Gender was one where we didn't see fateful choices earlier, other than franchise. And the economy, as we know, the choice was on planning before markets. Now, one of the things I think the outstanding achievements, which we really tend to underplay, is that state and nation development in India occurred with much, much less violence than has been the case with countries around the world. Now, this might surprise many of you because every day you see headlines about some violence, etc. But when we talk of violence in the process of state and nation building, it's not about a few murders here and there, or even the violence of Kashmir or the Northeast or in the Adivasi belt. We are talking of a violence like the American Civil War, 2% of the population is killed. If that you apply to India, that would be 30 million people. Similarly, sort of Britain, France, China, South Korea, Vietnam, all these countries, the degree, the intensity of mass violence in the process of nation building ran into millions and millions of people. By comparison, other than what happened at partition, India actually has had much, much less mass violence. And this matters because order, what we argue, is the prerequisite of having any economic development is that you need to establish order. And of course, establishing order is where a lot of violence takes place. In India's case, that was actually much less the case than in many other countries. Now, when we think of order or lack thereof, in the economic realm, one measure of the disorder is inflation, especially high inflation. And what you see is this is, if you compare India to a set of comparator to developing countries, India also, in this case as well, avoided extreme disorder, which is manifest in high inflation, which again, so two prerequisites for the development: establishing order in the political realm, establishing order in the economic realm, were two outstanding accomplishments of India. Then the question is, to what extent did India take advantage of having built this strong foundation? So, of course, in contrast to building order at a macro level, India failed to do so at the micro level. And we gave a range of data showing that. Many of you are aware about the exemplary role played by India's courts and India's police. This is just, if you look at the third row, India is an outlier in how low the incarceration rate is compared to other large countries. It has one of the lowest incarceration rates among large countries around the world. But it has the highest rate of under trials around the world, which is such a paradox. And of course, that we know the rate of for under trials is, it really is telling you about the problems of India's courts. The district courts, the high courts, the long period for trials, which is what is sort of reflected in the percentage of the prisoners in jail who are under trials. We look at a range of ways that India began or undertook nation building. one such instrument was fiscal federalism. In every country, there are richer parts of the country, there are poorer parts of the country. And one aspect of nation building is to try and equalize the resources that are available to citizens no matter where they live. And what you see here is that fiscal transfers to poorer states, which is basically, it's the Hindi belt and the eastern states, Orissa, Assam, and Bengal, West Bengal, have been steadily rising. And Arvind will come back to this to show how exactly these transfers are taking place. Now, in contrast to this mechanism of equalizing across states, what we have, and maybe I'll show you with this slide first. So this is the relative size of the second tier India compared to other federal systems. Now, it's not surprising that in most countries around the world, the subnational system is usually under 10 million. The only two countries that stand out there are India and China. However, whereas in India, most public employees are at the federal level, whereas in the US and China, which are the two other large countries, most employees are at the federal level and the local level. In India, it is at the state level. So many of the problems which we show, which is particularly with regard to public goods that are supposed to be provided by local bodies, the usual sanitation, roads, public health, primary education, it's not surprising that that is one place where India does quite poorly. It does so because India is one of the most centralized countries, if not the most centralized country, when it comes to the relationship between tier 2 and tier 3 of government. Our focus is almost always on the relationship between tier 1 and tier 2, but the real centralization, which we focus much less on, is between tier 2 and tier 3. In the chapter on state building, so we focus on two mechanisms of state building. One is physical connectivity, how you weave together a physical geography. And there are many measures. We're just showing you a couple of them. One is sort of major, just bridges crossing rivers. So till the 1980s, Bihar, a state of 100 million at that time, where the Ganga basically bisects the state, had one bridge across for the whole state. The entire northeast, 1,500 plus kilometers of the Brahmaputra, had just one bridge, right? We had severely underinvested. And if there is no bridge across a river, you can imagine its consequences for commerce, for trade, and for a variety of other things. What you really see is just how much that began to change after 1991, right? So the number of bridges per 1,000 kilometer of sort of river length compared to what it was around independence and what it is in 2022, you really see the process of state building unfolding. And you can see that by post offices and tele-density as well. The other mechanism of state building is what we call state presence. One of the things that we show is we know there is a lot of violence in the Adivasi belt of central India. And what you see is the Adivasi belt in central India for up to 2000, there was virtually no state presence. And by state presence, historically around the world, there have been three indicators of state presence: a police station, a public school, and a post office. And here we've looked at some other indicators. And what you see is how the average village distance from some indicator of the state presence. And again, you see, I mean, I wish we had the 2021 census results. I'm sure all of these would be, so even the better. I'll turn it over to Arvind now, and he'll continue.
So I want to echo what Devesh said in thanking Aromar IIHS, deemed to be university, whatever that means, for inviting us, and for all of you for showing up. And a special expression of special thanks and gratitude to Dr. Vijay Kelkar, who we also say in the book, very personal, because I would say for me, and probably also for Devesh, one of our original mentors was Devesh, was Dr. Vijay Kelkar many years ago. So it's a real pleasure and honor to have Vijay here. So, so when you write a book like this, which where Devesh keeps saying, "Oh, higher education is bad because we emphasize quantity over quality," that could be said of our book as well. By some people, it's a weighty book full of words, and so such a large book, something that we try and do is to try and draw out some themes emerging from the Indian development experience. So one theme is the sense of precociousness, i.e. doing something, before its time, or doing something somewhat irregularly sequenced. Devesh spoke about democracy before development, but of course, there's a very strong element of economic precociousness as well. The domestic manifestation of this is shown in the charts. It's agriculture, formal manufacturing, high-skilled services. The red line is India. And one of the ways we write about this is to summarize, India had prolonged ruralization, premature deindustrialization, and precocious servicification. We do too much agriculture for too long, very little manufacturing for too long, and at very high levels of IT services at relatively low levels of income compared to everyone else, most other countries. But this precociousness also has an international manifestation. And what is that? On the left-hand side, what we show here is it plots what is the, this is data from the US, what is the income per capita of different ethnic groups, who have immigrated to the United States, compared to what the per capita GDP of the origin country from where these immigrants come. And you can see that India, the factor is a factor of 30, that 30 or 32. The average Indian origin household in the US earns about 30 to 35 times more than his or her counterpart living back in India. And that's kind of, and of course, India, it's the most prosperous group in the US. So, and the thing is that this has happened because of the export of high-skilled talent through migration. On the right-hand side, we see the costs of this precociousness. On the y-axis, what you see is the share of a country in global low-skill exports. And on the x-axis, you see the share of the country in the global labor force. So the intuition roughly is that, if you have 10% of the global labor force, then roughly you should be accounting for 10% of the global market share in unskilled exports. And look at the contrast between China and India. China and India account for roughly similar shares of the global labor force, but China's global export market share, 40 to 50, India 2 to 3. And that shortfall of India, had India exported as much as its labor force, we would have had so much more employment, so much more exports, and so much more growth. So in a sense, there has been a cost to the economic precociousness. Just as I'm going to tell you later, there's also been a cost to the political precociousness. This whole democracy thing. But we also use the theme of precociousness in a different sense, which is that policy choices were made that were somewhat irregularly sequenced. For example, India, or the Indian state, emphasized welfare and redistribution before providing the basic public goods, namely public health, basic education, and infrastructure. And you didn't see, for example, you saw 1950 and 2022, which Devesh showed. But if you looked at it from 1950 to 1990, the progress was very, very slow in India. So we emphasized, and we have a line saying this was almost like a caste system-like hierarchy of choices. Building physical capital over investing in people's lives, their quality of living, and the capabilities to realize improvement. Within physical capital, building capital-intensive state factories over the public goods of infrastructure, and so on. Within infrastructure, it favored subsidizing the minority who had access rather than recovering charges and expanding access. Within human capital, education over health. Within education, higher education over basic education. And within health, we privileged family planning and disease control over public sanitation, public health, and public. So it's really a caste system of hierarchical of choices, which were very different in other successful countries. This is just a table that illustrates these choices. I'll skip over them. So another theme that runs through our book is what we call my Bapism. Now, this is not, we want to distinguish this from statism. Statism is, you want to emphasize planning, you want to emphasize public, infrastructure, whatever you want to do. But what we say is that there is a DNA which runs across Indian society, not just the state. And in some sense, the state reflects societal preferences, which is in the DNA of Indian society, which is my Bapism, which is that, anything goes wrong in your lives, you want to turn to the state for help and succor, because even though the state has famously and consistently shortchanged its society, we still turn to that. Why is this my Bapism important? Because it helps shed light on some of the other pathologies. Now, Dr. Vijay Kelkar used to be, chairman of the Bureau of Industrial Costs and Prices associated with, the public sector for a very long time. So we put together data in this book we calculate the return in central public sector enterprises from 71 to today. We also do this for state public sector undertakings. So two things to note. One is, in both cases, consistent underperformance consistent underperformance reflected in rates of return consistently below what the opportunity cost of investing that capital elsewhere. So because it's consistent in things, we never really. So remember, getting into public sector enterprises was not a mistake or some anomalous choice, because at that time, that's what most countries around the world did. So India was doing, and it's not as if India's public sector, the size and scope, was much bigger than other countries. The problem was we got into it, and despite underperformance, we really didn't get out of it. We call this the Chakravyuha challenge. Abhimanyu knows how to get in, the Indian state knows how to get in, but it can't get out. But there's a third theme which comes out of showing these two charts, which is that you will notice that central public sector enterprises, especially the oil sector, didn't do too badly. And in some cases, during the boom era, even other sectors did well. But state public sector enterprises, especially the electricity sector, which we can document, do much worse than central. So this leads to one of the themes of our book, which says, anything that the center does badly in India, the states do much worse. Whether it's the legislature, whether it's finance commission, whether it's the judiciary. And so therefore, we obsess too much with what's happening at the center to the neglect of what's not happening at the states. And then, of course, Devesh goes further and he said, not enough in terms of what happens at the third tier of government. Now, we also, for the first time, we document what the opportunity costs of these investment in public sector enterprises and banks. We show that center and states combined, every year for about 50 years, 1.25 to 2.5 percentage points of GDP. Just to give that flesh, if the states had earned a reasonable rate of return on the investments, the states as a whole could have doubled their health expenditure every year. That was the cost. And it's my barbarism that kind of obscured these numbers, because I don't think people were even looking at these numbers or quantifying these numbers, and therefore we never got the accountability that we deserve to have. Now, this is one theme which I want to emphasize particularly because Dr. Kelkar is here. To India's, if I were to ask you who are two of India's greatest economists, poll, quickly, who are two of India's greatest economists? Huh? Sorry, first one? Amartya Sen. Always the Bengalis get precedence. Okay, Amartya Sen. Who's the second? Huh? We're talking about, he was a great, of course, practitioner, but in the realm of ideas and, thinking about the Indian development experience. Huh? Mahalanobis. Well, that's good. That's a good question. Again, another Bengali. I mean, come on. We have to diversify here. Come on. So in fact, I'm to be less facetious. Debates in India traditionally over the last 50 years has been between kind of Amartya Sen and Jagdish Bhagwati. One saying Jagdish Bhagwati associated with, growth is very important because it allows you to do many other things. Amartya Sen famously, we need to focus on, also about how we distribute the pie, as it were, especially focusing on the poorer. What we say in the book is that actually they're both actually maybe not completely right, because growth was not the most important thing in India. It has almost been everything in India. And in fact, in the final chapter, we quote the great Dr. Vijay Kelkar's wisest statement when he said, the best and only good foreign policy is 10% economic growth. And that's kind of exemplified in other aspects of life as well. So growth, the era of growth led to the largest poverty reduction and improvement in economic lives. It changed the dynamic of education. Now, up to 1980, 1990, even on enrollment, we were not doing very well. But when growth happened, two things happened. Resources became available to the states to spend more on education. And in the earlier table that I didn't go through, you can see that. But also there's a much more subtle effect that happened. Once growth improved and surged, the returns to education increased, so that parents were then sending the children to get education, whether it be, if the public schools were not working well, send them to private schools, get private tuition. And so the dynamic of education changed because of economic growth. The other irony, of course, is that the neoliberal state, which everyone rails against after 1990, neoliberal state, it is the neoliberal state because of economic growth that became the caring state. The improvements in infrastructure, in employment guarantee scheme, the social welfare net that we've built up in the last 20 years happened in the era of economic growth. And of course, social change, and Devesh has written about this extensively before, it had enormous impacts on social change, which I will let Devesh answer in response to question. So in a sense, what we say, summarize this by saying that growth was not just grist, grease, glue, and getaway. It was the acceleration of growth since 1980 that fomented the revolution of rising expectations, which allowed India to trace the Naipaul arc. Remember, V.S. Naipaul had a trilogy of India, from civilizational diffidence and woundedness to aspiration for 1.4 billion people. And I think, and the last point on growth is that we got a rapid growth after 1980, but it was also divergent growth across the states. That created its own set of opportunities and challenges. It altered the discourse on fiscal federalism because the resource availability also started diverging between poorer and richer states. And of course, it was divergent growth that has accelerated internal migration within India. Now, this is the other surprise on growth. There are two big surprises on growth I want to focus on. One is this chart. Now, I'll explain this in a second. If you often discussions about India today over the last 10, 15 years would say, wish we could be more like China, then we could get Chinese rates of growth. Our democracy stymies economic growth because it puts brakes on economic growth. What this chart shows is beginning in 1980, if you set all the countries in the world, index them at 100, and see what their per capita GDP is, 50, 60, 40 years later, be true even now, 45 years later, what we find, which is a surprise to us, 1/3 of India, which is the south, the west, and Haryana, grew almost as fast as China and for almost as long. So, in a sense, within India, 1/3 of India was almost like China. So the question we should be asking ourselves today is not why India is not like China, but why 2/3 of India is not like the China within India, which is 1/3 of India. And so I think we should now really be thinking, therefore, much more about how to spread prosperity to the Hindi heartland based on our own experience, of course, in addition to experience elsewhere as well. Again, this is a very important point which we hadn't realized. This is a chart that shows what is the average fiscal deficit of India and a number of comparator countries in the era of rapid growth. This is not India when India was not growing. What you find is that this is central and state government combined. India has the highest fiscal deficit of all major developing countries and comparator countries in the world. It's been about 8% of GDP for now 30, 40, 35 years. And the circle above just shows if you add on the losses of the public sector enterprises, it's actually double-digit fiscal deficits for. So the question, one of the questions we ask ourselves is why is this the case? And we say the answer is the Kamadhenu fiscal state, an indiscriminate, abundantly giving state that gives to everyone. And it gives, how does it give? It takes away most people from the tax net. And it's not just the poor who don't pay taxes. If you look at the middle class, they get massive tax breaks. If you look at the rich, they get massive tax breaks. Rich farmers get massive tax breaks. Landed gentry in India are virtually not taxed at all. And on the expenditure side too, all manner of subsidies are given to all constituencies in India. And the Kamadhenu state, I think, is explained best by this quote from I.G. Patel, which we have in the book, to explain why is this the case. And he says, I suspect the divisive character of Indian society, the need to preserve the Indian Federation, the workings of a parliamentary democracy where 100 and even 1,000 flowers have to be allowed to bloom, all led to a kind of eclectic melange where every policy of special pleading found a place. So Indian democracy is like an equal opportunity vested interest creator, facilitator, and sustainer. So the old Pranab Bardhan idea that there was some 2 or 3 strong vested interests, I think that's only partially true. Almost every group has claims to the Indian state, and the Kamadhenu fiscal state provides abundantly. The fiscal transfer story is actually very, very interesting. Devesh showed you rising fiscal transfers towards the poorer states. What we show here is we break that up into who are the beneficiary states and who are the kind of states. So above the line, the green and the brown lines are, so the green line is the Hindi heartland. We have to, categorize the states into different categories, just almost for convenience. So any number above 1 means you get more in fiscal resources than you contribute to the fiscal base, as it were. And below the line are those regions who give more than they contribute to the tax base. So 2 things I notice. One, the surprise for Devesh and me is that although the political clamor is mostly coming from the south, just to remind you, D.K. Suresh, the brother of D.K. Shiv Kumar, 2-3 years ago, thundered and said, all our GST resources in Karnataka being taken away by the rest of the country, etc., etc. And so the thing is that, but it's only partially fair for him to say that, because in fact, the biggest donors, fiscal donors, is not the red line. The red line is the South, and it's giving, some amount. The biggest donors are, in fact, the West, Gujarat and Maharashtra, and Haryana to some extent. So purely in fiscal terms, the donor-beneficiary relationship, it's not that the South is giving the most. But the reason the South protests the most is because of other reasons which we can get into in this. The last point I would say in this is that, look, every federal union has to have mechanisms of transferring resources from rich states to poor states. I think that's unobjectionable, and it's what makes India a union. We want the citizen in Bihar to get as much access to fiscal and publicly provide services that we do, broadly not identical, but at least similar. And therefore, some transfer is justified. But I think the problem in India is that the identity of the donors and beneficiaries have been fixed for all time, and the transfers are rising consistently. And what this suggests is that, or what the implication is that those who are receiving this despite underperformance. So it's almost like we've built a system of incentives in these fiscal transfers where overperformance by the southern and the western states is being penalized, and underperformance by the northern states. And so I think there would be no objection if steadily over time, no one is saying that it should be zero transfers, but it should not be open-ended and rising all the time. And I hope the next Finance Commission will address this point. So what is the overall assessment we come down on? This is on GDP per capita. I want to focus on is that, so we've plotted this. These are numbers which say, supposing there were 100 countries in the world, so you normalize the actual to 100. India began per capita GDP in 1950, 79. That's the 79th, i.e. 79 means 79 out of 100. It's the opposite. It's done very poorly. 1 is the best, 100 is the poorest, 79 is towards the bottom. In the planning era, it became worse. India went from 79th ranking to 85. And although since then we've caught up because of rapid growth, we've only gone from 85 to 66. We are still the 66th poorest in terms of per capita GDP. So we should all take a thing and not get seduced by, we're the 4th largest economy, because in terms of the average standard of living, we're still in the bottom 4th quartile, as it were. On the Human Development Index, which combines income, health, and education, it's a bit worse, actually, and you will see that in the numbers. So I want to end by just very quickly saying the magic and paradox of India, democracy, how we sustain it, all the things that Devesh spoke about. The under-recognized, unheralded achievements, how democracy itself was able to create a sense of nationhood, bring about order, again, the things that Devesh spoke about. The delayed and partial success, what we just said, economic growth and things, delayed and only partial. The durable disappointment on human development, a sense of true fraternity amongst India, I think that's still very, very elusive. The abiding irony is that some of this has happened because maybe, partially, or we at least speculate, because of democracy itself. So we use a line from the famous Ajit dialogue, which says, he says to his Saidi, Ramu, isko liquid oxygen mein pheng do. Liquid is a jeene nahi dega, oxygen is a marne nahi dega. And democracy has this feature. It is the oxygen of India. The romance, the high, the activity, the pastime, almost a sacred vocation of India is democracy, but also in many ways, as we discuss in the book, it also creates challenges. And of course, we end the book by saying the looming tragedy for India is that all those early successes that were achieved, which in the context of the world were no mean achievements, to preserve order, not to have violence, it didn't happen that way in vast parts of the world or even in our region. Lots of social disorder, a lot of chaos, breaking up of states, no sense of nationhood, but in India we did have that. So, And we also had very good relations between the center and the states. The trust was very high. The looming tragedy is we are under threat of losing some of these early, important, and very difficult achievements.
Thanks, Arvind. That was really... So just quickly, I mean, this is a book. Huh? I mean, it's a doorstopper in some senses. So 600 pages to read, but more interesting for the academics and the researchers, 250 pages of notes and references, which is what makes it quite interesting. So to balance that out, actually, I brought down from our library. We're one of the few libraries who are a public library, but also we have a original photolitho version of the Constitution as it was hand-scripted, just as both in Hindi and English, and you can see the differences if you open it up, just as a sort of pointer to that. So yeah, we got, this is a tremendous book because unlike many others, it's contemporary. It's looking at the world as it is just now. But a few, quick reflections. They've asked some really sharp questions which they touched on in the beginning, which I think as an institution, otherwise we deal with and we struggle with in our teaching. The first, of course, is how do you forge a nation? And they've dealt with that, I think, quite clearly in the beginning, and they've laid out the particular circumstances and the choices that helped the forging of the nation, the fact that the job is very, very far from complete, even though we're claiming victory in some senses. The second one is how do you overhaul the state, in which we've done pretty badly in some senses. We've fallen back. And of course, we had a colonial state to live with. Even that document is so close to the 1935 Government of India Act that it has some deep flaws, including the question of the third tier, which we had to introduce later. The fourth, of course, which I think they've dealt with very well, and I think we'll have a good discussion on, is actually how do you construct an economy, and how do you do this, dance between planning and then, of course, the market, and how do you build market mechanisms, which we have in some senses done pretty well, and also had other, unfortunately, Chandu's not here, but I mean, he was the chair of SEBI, so he's seen some of those things in some senses. And then I think the more difficult question, which I think I'll try and sort of prod you to try and address, and that was the Ambedkarite question in some senses. You call it changing a society. I think his vision certainly was about transforming society. Yes, transforming society. So how is one done on that, and where is that going? So they're interesting mixed responses as far as that's concerned. So those are the four big questions, and they've really, I think, tried to address them. These are really hard, and they've looked at the historical question, of course. I'll try and take this in three parts. The first one is looking at the evidence they have. So the first thing is just a personal reflection here. So what is said in the title, and maybe not so clearly said in the book. So you're saying, fair enough, we're 1/6 of humanity. In fact, we're the largest nation in history, in all of history at the current point of time. But there are some asymmetries which are interesting, and I think this last set of slides Arvind dealt with. We're also 1/10 of, India has 1/10 of the people who are extremely poor in the world. So while we have 1/6 of the population, we have a larger proportion who are extremely poor. And if you look at multidimensional poverty, it's about one in 6. So there is that. So we are still, even though we have these great claims towards development, we are still an extremely poor country, and that's quite clearly obvious. And we're also a country in which there are very large numbers. If you look at multidimensional poverty, we're talking about 200+ million people. And that's not counting people who are just above the poverty line. And if they're hit by a shock, can go below that. So that's one part. But also the other thing, again, obvious but not so obvious when I look at the numbers there, was that in our share, or at least the current narrative, we are only we're about 4% of global output, of global wealth, and global market cap also. I was surprised that all three of them, I guess you're a great scholar of that, they are very closely correlated. So if you look at the long-term trend, where 1/25 of, so 1/6 of the population, but just 1/25 of the output of the wealth and the market cap, in spite of the thing that the Indian private sector is doing very well. So there is that deep asymmetry there, especially when you compare it with China, and Arvind is a great scholar of China. You can see this huge divergence. We see the divergence in India between regions, but you also see the divergence across other things. But there are some other things which we don't necessarily talk about. So 1/6 of the world's population, but only 1/40th of the world's land. We're actually a very land scarce country. That's pretty obvious, fine? We talk about agriculture and land scarcity there. But the interesting other part of India is that we actually hold, and this is an interesting thing that people don't necessarily, we hold about 1/6 of the world's irrigated land. So while we have a much smaller share of land, we actually hold a large part of the irrigated land, even after we lost a lot of irrigated land to Pakistan along the western thing as far as that's concerned. Which is the reason why we are 1/10 of the world agricultural production. So there's an interesting other side of the story, and this is where China struggles in some senses because they don't have that much irrigated land. They've been trying very hard. They're now moving, water from maybe Tibet all the way out, etc. So there's been a countervailing fact in our resource balance or constraint as far as that's concerned. Plus, of course, getting to 1/10 of world product as far as agriculture is concerned has been a pretty big deal. It's had many outcomes. Of course, what it means is with 1/6 of the population, 1/10 of the agriculture, you have to trade. So, the obvious side of that is that India, irrespective of where we go over the 21st century, will have to trade on whatever account it is unless we do dramatic things in agriculture as far as food is concerned. So we shouldn't give up on trade because we need it desperately. But the other constraint, I think, which again you've touched on a little bit in the book, is really on the energy side. Because a lot of this stuff has been driven, like you said, by technology. And that's where we have a serious challenge. So we have probably about 0.8% of the world's oil, which has worked on that for ages. So 1/6 of the population having 1/125th of the world's oil, and gas is even worse. We have much less gas. So we have very much less gas. The obvious thing, of course, is that we have 1/10 of the world's coal. So India's own position on a whole range of things, including climate, is driven by that reality. So we have a very serious energy constraint, and and our coals, as you know, are not very good. We have many colleagues who work on that question in this room. So we have a big issue. You can't really move the economy out unless you're, and the obvious thing, of course, because oil and gas have been historically linked to, inflation, et cetera, because they're imported. That's another key question. So on the other side of it, especially when we're talking to climate, and we'll come to that as maybe at the end of this thing, is that we're only, maybe we're about 8.5%, 9% of global emissions. So even though we have such a small share of oil and gas and a little bit more of coal, our emissions numbers are not very bad at the moment, primarily because public services are so bad. Because you have large numbers of people who don't have that. So what I'm saying is we have very serious constraints on land, which in some senses, because of irrigation and all that development which you see, which has gone into the political economy, we're not doing so badly as far as food is concerned. On the energy side, we're not doing very well, even though now on the renewables end, of course, China is doing much better than India. We have about 4% of the world's renewables. So if you look at this frame in terms of the constraints that we've had, are there any reflections that you've talked about many other constraints within the state, within society, etc. But we will have to, over the next 30 or 40 years, especially as India hits 101.6 billion, etc., experience these constraints much more really. Any thoughts about that? How has that played itself out? As you look at these questions at all? Sorry, Arvind, just pick up the mic. Sorry,
So if you take agriculture, you mentioned that India has more irrigated land than China. The irony is yields in China are double that of India, right? I mean, we look at cotton, which has been grown in India since when?
2,500 years, yeah.
And yet, I mean, yields of sugar cane, cotton, rice, wheat, we are somewhat closer to the world average. We are below world average and way below China.
And we're declining also, right? In most places. Yeah.
So your land constraint, which you need for food, if your yields were just world average, you would have way more land than you're wasting land on low productivity agriculture rather than, I mean, take a country like Netherlands. It's a tiny country. It's the world's second largest exporter of food, of agriculture. We would not believe it, right? In that tiny amount of land, look at the productivity. They have vertical farms, every damn thing. So we just use our resources extremely inefficiently because the agriculture model has moved to a model of subsidies, right? Whether fertilizer, electricity, water. It has not moved to a model in which you have high-yielding seed varieties, good agriculture extension, which was all built in the 60s and 70s, as you know, with the Green Revolution, but all began to wither away. So I think some of these constraints are self-imposed. They are not. They should have been overcome, can be overcome, but there's a real political economy challenge.
Is there a divergence on agriculture, like you've seen, west and south between north and east? Is that a core driver of the question of the divergence between states that you see?
Not as much. Actually, I think
In terms of productivity,
I
for
mean,
example?
initially, of course, we know the Northwest story. In fact, some other work not part of the book. I mean, if you look at agricultural markets, they are much more vibrant in Bihar than in Punjab. Punjab, because everything is rice and wheat, which you share
With the PDS.
with fixed price, there is no dynamism. And in some ways, as you know, Bihar is well endowed with water and so on. And so, in some ways, Bihar can be a much better success story on agriculture than it is. It has it has horticulture, it has fruits. I mean, one of the things we show, which is the irony of India's agriculture, today, less than half of rural income is from agriculture. Less than half of agriculture income is from crops. Less than half of crop income is from cereals. Yet, the entire government machinery subsidies is on cereals. The fastest growing agricultural sectors, horticulture, animal husbandry, is where you have the least government intervention. The ones that have grown the slowest and take the most resources are where you have the most government intervention.
Just two thoughts. I mean, when you say we have 1/6 of the irrigated area, and I would flip it around and say maybe that's too much because of the subsidies that we give for water intake. Punjab has no business to be growing rice.
Absolutely. We're overdrawing.
And as you know, because of that, because we are 1/6 of irrigated thing, we export water to the rest of. So we're a water scarce country that's exporting water to the rest of the world.
We're the largest exporter of water in the world, so embedded in our export.
I want to come to electricity in a second. But notice that the subsidies that we give, take the fertilizer subsidy and the farm power subsidy and this, right? There is nothing about democracy or socialism that justifies those subsidies. Because we've done this work, and some of it is in the book, 60 to 70% of subsidies in fertilizer and in electricity, they go to the top 5-10% of farmers. And in electricity, the household subsidy, by the way, today in electricity, subsidies to households are as much as subsidies to agriculture today. And within households, 60 to 70% goes to the top 5-10%. So if you believe in the median voter theory of democracy, this is not democracy at all. This is just the inability to do reasonable, rational policy. That's one. The second thing is on the future of because the future is all going to be renewable energy, right? And as you know, so when people draw the India-China comparison on electricity and power, I think 2 or 3 things we have to really has to sink in, is that we talk about artificial intelligence, etc. The key critical input for this is going to be electricity. China is already the world's largest, most efficient electrostate, and electrostate increasingly powered by renewables. India, if I were to give you some number, for example, the price paid by Indian manufacturing for power is double what it should be. And let us not be fooled by the capacity numbers on renewable. There are serious impediments to actually converting that capacity to actually production and use of this. And I think one of the exit lessons we haven't applied is to the power distribution sector. It is still in 2025, not everywhere, it's still a public sector monopoly. I mean, have we not learned the lesson that monopolies are bad and public sector monopolies are worse? And that's what's setting. So that's going to seriously, China is ahead of the US on the electrostate. We are lagging way behind on creating a renewable. So we need to, just supporting what you're saying, but what Devesh and I try and tell you is that the Indian situation is actually, reflects a lot of policy choices, bad policy choices, which are neither democracy nor socialism.
Yes, I mean, I think, the set of those 10 sort of odd but very dramatic policy choices have forced us in is actually a nice way to do it. It would form a really great course to run if you're able to do that. But just to pick up on something else, very different space altogether. you talked about, the really unique things about the founding experience in some senses. And you didn't speak about it just now, but I thought there were, some very sharp comments in the book about the idea of the Indian political settlement of the 50s, 60s, etc., being tied to the idea of just political means. And you focused on three things: democracy, freedom, and also non-violence. Fine. Do we think we've gone anywhere as far as this is concerned? Or, like you quote Krishna Kumar, we're in search of a person who was lost somewhere else, which of course the audience doesn't know. But any comments on that? Because I think when you come back and you say at the end of it, it is about democracy and good governance, the point is good governance has also got a culture of governance, fine? And is that something that we've seriously are still in search of, are lost, or it's something that's going to be very difficult for us to recover?
So I think the quote that Haro is sort of referring to is, it's an interview that Pandit Nehru had with, I think, André Malraux in the late 50s. And he was asked by what were the biggest challenges he faced as a prime minister. And if I recall, he had two. He said, creating a secular country out of a very religious society. And the second was trying to have just ends through just means, which of course has always been central challenge in
any state building, yeah.
Right. And I think I think where there is an issue, I think, you both come away in seeing the incredible thinker that Pandit Nehru was. But sometimes you need a good banya to run things. And that he was not.
Of course not.
And so on the implementation side, say just public administration, and right from the 50s it's clear that public administration, the amazing thing we show is that you have to read these reports, and we've read 12-volume National Irrigation Commission, 16-volume National Agricultural Commission, 13-volume National Police Commission, and the urbanization, that.
Yes.
The Indian state was genuinely
reflexive, as you call it.
Self-reflective, even self-flagellating.
Because it couldn't do very much.
But not self-correcting. Repeatedly, you see the same things being said decade after decade, not much of a difference. And then the puzzle arises, well, if you're aware of it, why doesn't it happen? Yeah. And so public administration, you clearly see, right? If you read the first public administration reforms and the second, I mean, you can transform paragraphs from one to the other, you would not notice the difference, right? The various, reports on courts and the problem with the lower courts. If you see the Law Commission reports, and literally I'll say this, 1950s,
yes,
1960s, 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, exactly the same thing they're saying.
Yeah. Pendency of trial, under trial, all the stuff that you showed.
Everything. Yeah. So there isn't, in that sense, the degree of self-awareness is remarkable. The degree of lack of self-correction is also equally remarkable. And so that is the puzzle that, we can speculate, etc. But I don't think so we have a very convincing answer of the why.
Okay.
So I can say there's a vested interest.
No, that's fine.
But see, but of course, I don't know whether you want to call it good news or bad news, that, what we keep saying about the lack of a self-correcting exit. But then, of course, exit has happened.
Mm-hmm. And it happened under crisis.
Yeah, so there are three ways in which this has happened, right? One is crises, obviously. 1991, famously, we ran short of foreign exchange, and then we had the big reform. 1966, very important for the, the Green Revolution and the thing. The second way in which it's happened, of course, is through technology. That, famously, the telecommunications revolution has happened because of this. But what we want to emphasize in the book is The third way in which it happened, both in anticipated but unanticipated, is economic growth itself. Economic growth became, political scientists talk about this, how much agency do states really have if society is so hierarchical and democracy also then? So then, especially because of these constraints on state action, it was these exogenous forces that created, and economic growth was really the biggest. So of course, then you can go back and say, well, how do you get the growth? But I don't think we should ever lose sight of what India was in 1980 and what it is in 2025. Even the state, for example, right? I mean, for all its failings, on the digital side, we are still close to the cutting edge. So improvements have been made, and economic growth has been a powerful driver of change in India.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned those 4 or 5 things on the positive side. IT is the obvious one, that India's digital state is actually cutting edge worldwide as far as that's concerned. You mentioned safety nets, which in some senses now, fed back into the political system in other ways. Exactly. And also building a national market. Building a national market on GST and the backbone of a digital stuff. These are all good things. But there's one conundrum which I think you touch on, but and we struggle with it as an institution, and that is, informality. Right? So you talk about ruralization, etc., but the informality story, in some senses, you go from a large informal rural sector to a large urban sector, and one that's dominated by services. So not following the standard model.
We say that in the
yes.
We've just gone from one form of informality to another
form of informality. Fine, and that's a deep structural constraint in some senses. There are no historical examples of this kind of thing, having deep informality in a service-led economy. So any thoughts about that? Where are we going as far as that? What will that play itself out? And how
the reason why that remained the case was because we were not able to create vibrant, low-skill manufacturing, which would have provided the traditional ladder of development, which was our failure on that is what has led to high levels of informality. So, it's no secret that going forward, jobs, creating employment, reasonably well-paid, reasonably productive jobs, still very important. And that's why those who kind of wield this mantra of IT services are kind of, misrecognizing or underestimating that will only provide more formal sector jobs for 1 to 2% of the labor force. And for the remaining, I think we still have to.
So the question is, in a country where the aspiration has certainly moved towards the service sector, upper end thing process, to be able to reinsert in the sociological imagination a manufacturing sector job, whether it is the artisan becoming manufactured or otherwise, is going to be a very interesting challenge. That's one thing. Of course, the other people who explain this as being tied to both caste and gender inequality, fine? Because, if you look at what's happening in terms of female workforce participation, we're doing very badly, and the exits are happening as education is rising. So it's contrary to anything that we know from kicking the ladder and stuff like that. So is it a little bit of a simplistic explanation to say, okay, fair enough, we have to go back to the standard model, which the Chinese are ahead of us in any case? How can we kind of, enable this growth of productive jobs that are there, or can we use safety nets to be able to provide for that? There's this magic bullet now that's being put forward in the labor codes. How will that play itself out? Because I think this is a core conundrum of both employment and, for us, urbanization, because this is where the story sits in some senses.
So one of the things we show in the book, so often this thing has been made that having created the welfare state early on, or having created the legal environment for with labor codes, labor laws that were really meant for countries with much higher levels of per capita income, and all the negative effects they had. What we show is actually, especially on the manufacturing side, one other major constraint has been government labor markets. Mm-hmm. Government labor markets have meant, as you know, the vast majority of government employees are so-called Group C, what used to be C and D now, right? Their wages are much higher than what you would get in a what a firm would pay in a manufacturing sector to be competitive. So it sets a reservation wage that is much higher than what the market would pay. And so, of course, everyone is desperate to get that job. Not only are you getting a much higher pay, you are going to be employed for the rest of your life. You are going to get all these benefits. And for all you know, there might be rents as well. Right? So that has been a severe distortion in multiple ways. I mean, the fact that literally tens of millions of young people spend years of their lives, of which 0.1% is going to get a job, is just an extraordinary waste of young talent. So the government labor market is also playing a very distortionary effect. So in this.
So just to build on what Devesh said, economists have this term called the Dutch disease, right? The Dutch disease is when one sector like oil does very well in an economy, it exerts a very unfavorable adverse effect on other tradable sectors like employment-intensive manufacturing. In India, and this is what we say in the chapter on why we didn't see structural transformation, there have been two forms of the Dutch disease in India. One is what Devesh said, that if the government sector is so attractive, if it has such high wages, remember, in the government sector, wage compression is very low in the Indian wage sector. Wages at the bottom are very, very high, which is the reservation wage for manufacturing. So the government exerts a kind of Dutch disease effect. But I think we should also be honest in recognizing that the rapid explosion of the services sector also creates a kind of Dutch disease for manufacturing, low-skill manufacturing. So in a sense, therefore, we say that we must develop all sectors and find wherever we can. But the point is there are some what we call general equilibrium effects. Some sectors do well, very good, but if they are only employing a small fraction of the labor force and they have negative effects on other sectors, then there's a problem. But just to finish going forward, see, the looming challenge ahead, of course, is artificial intelligence. Everyone knows about that. But think of it in the case of India, why it's maybe particularly pernicious. Because our successful sector is
knowledge services.
IT services. No, not high-tech stuff, but we are in that space, exact space, which are most threatened by AI. Coding, back office services, etc. So that's one problem. The other problem is that even if we become successful in manufacturing, let's say, see, we have 2 to 3% of global market share in unskilled exports. China is like 50. Even if we got to 10 or 15, which I think we should strive to do, we are never going to get 25, the employment payoff from that will be much less than in the past because even those are being robotized. So the employment, so in a sense, therefore, we have to plan for a future where we still try and get manufacturing. We also try and improve the productivity of other non-tradable services, or even tourism, for example, is a kind of service which is very employment intensive, and where we can, India, it's shocking how few tourists we have in India, both domestic and foreign, compared to what our geography and history and gives us. So there are other opportunities, and we should think about all of them.
Although I would slightly differ from Arvind, I think the AI story is going to be much more mixed. It also offers India enormous possibility,
especially backward integration into a whole range of processes.
But also education and health. Yeah. I mean, a young person, a student in a rural or small town who has access to poor teachers, now has an excellent teacher at hand, which can really raise the human capital at the base level in ways that simply would not have been possible otherwise.
So I'll just close with a few things that you close your book with, where you're saying 4 big future challenges: geopolitics, demography, technology, and climate. And then, of course, you say you don't want to go into too much detail, so you'll say So just some sense of how those challenges will play itself out and what you think the structural responses are, given the nature of where India is. So we can just split it between yourselves. I mean, demography, if you can pick, then geopolitics, of course, is Arvind's.
So, one of the interesting demographic facts which we point out is between 1950 and 2025, India added 1 billion people to its population. In those 75 years. In the next 75 years, 2025 to the end of this century, India will add a net of 0 people. So from 1 billion people over 75 years, you're going to go to 0. Because the fertility decline is happening so rapidly. So yes, the population will go up and then it will start to come down. So on a net, the population increase. So what that means, for instance, the number of school-going children in India has already peaked. Which means that for the first time for decades, we had to run faster just to keep still because you had to keep building more schools, hiring more teachers.
Now schools are closed like in Kerala, whatever.
Right. So now, in principle at least, you can really focus on learning rather than enrollment. Because the enrollment problem is no longer, right? So there are some of these demographics. Of course, we're going to face the other side as Kerala and Tamil, which is aging, which is going to happen much more, and what that means for family structures. But still, in that regard, what you see in countries like Korea or Japan, I mean, it is those societies could virtually face collapse. I mean, the problem with Ukraine, as recent articles have shown, is not just Russia, its population is just about to collapse, right?
Just like Russia is collapsing too.
Yeah. So the demographic story, I think, as Arvind had pointed out, at least for the next 20, 30 years is going to be jobs, 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 jobs. Where are they? I think on geopolitics before Arvind goes, in some ways, I actually think Trump has done us a big favor. Look,
with the 50% tariff.
I mean, in the sense, Arvind and I talk, I mean, this is being facetious, but basically, to put a crude Hindi word, hum besharmi hai. As a society, we don't really move until we are kicked. You know, as you know, that's why crisis. So you suddenly see this government which was quite happy that we are so great, etc., etc. Now suddenly you see some reforms, some genuine, thinking and realization just how precarious India is, being caught between a rock
and a very, very hard place.
And a very, very hard place, which is the neighbor in the north.
Yeah.
So on demography, I just want to say that demographically, even though fertility is declining everywhere, we're going to be 2 Indias for a very long time. A young Hindi heartland and an aging peninsular India. By the way, fertility in West Bengal is also plummeting very sharply, has plummeted sharply.
Actually, 3 Indias.
Maybe a third.
Older people in agricultural areas, 100 million who are mobile and part of the middle class.
So the thing is that therefore it presents both challenges obviously, but also opportunities because it provides the scope for people to migrate from. The fact is there's a lot of migrants in the southern states from the north, which is a good thing. And from Bengal and from the northeast, which up to a point is not a bad thing. But then beyond a point, it can become politically very, contentious. And therefore, even when you think about demography, it's not one demographical pattern in India, but at least two, and which creates both opportunities and challenges. Because if you want more migration, we have to think about, the portability of benefits. We have to think about how we manage that and so on. On geopolitics, absolutely, Trump has whatever. But do the following thought experiment. When Trump first came to power, most of us certainly thought that, India would certainly not be the worst treated. And we certainly thought China would be amongst the worst treated. December 2025, the highest tariffs that Trump has imposed is on India. What does that show? What it shows very clearly is that we have been exposed in not having the kind of geopolitical strength which China has and which many other countries. And in turn, that geopolitical strength has not been there. because of the Vijay Kelkar rule. We are not a dynamic, fast-growing country which everyone wants to come to. Remember, even 5 years ago, foreign capital was very interested, and that gave us power.
You could see it with the repeat at the
Yeah,
moment.
and that gave us power. And so the fact that what this whole episode has exposed, especially the contrast between the way we've treated China and India have been treated, is that despite all the hype, and in some ways, I think it's not only, I think exactly what he said, I mean, this emperor that was India, which was claiming to be Vishwaguru, all of that, we have been exposed as, not having no clothes, but, basically just a chaddi maybe, and that we are pretty naked. And therefore, the impetus that has come is highly desirable. But once again, we have to, I think, do all the hard things. And the government, to its credit, has made a very good response. Yeah. GST, the removal of the import barriers and the quality control orders, and most recently the labor codes and so on. But this is something, this is not one-off. It has to be sustained because we have to, I mean, the Chinese have this expression called, it's called national power. What are the sources of national power? And economic strength is a big part of that.
Can I just add one thought to that? If you ask, is there anything that the world, India makes, that the world can't do without?
Apollo?
Pehle aap. So the fact is, the fact is, we don't have that. We simply don't. Whether it's rare magnets or China.
Or even Bollywood.
Huh?
Bollywood.
Well, if
Cricket now into America.
Yeah. So, it is a humbling thing that if you are 1/6 of humanity, and the world can live without you. And if you don't recognize that reality, you will not recognize the challenges facing you.
I do think this is, it's a bit controversial to say, and one should be careful, is that
I hope you're not streaming.
It is streaming, but I want to say it in a very diplomatic manner. It doesn't make, this is where I think, talent, expertise, the space for dissident critical voices is very, very critical. Otherwise, we're in this echo chamber and bubble of, the Vishwaguru and the world leaders. But as Devesh said, what is it that the world really, we have to offer the world really wants? But the point was that 15, 20 years ago, even though we were poorer, we were seen as, a place with potential. We had a voice. We had a voice also because...
And we had a moral stand.
Exactly. Exactly. And that soft power of ours, so it's the hard power we've lost, and the soft power as well, we no longer have the... So just one small personal anecdote. I wrote a book on China, as you know, and when I used to present it in China, the Chinese officials, all they wanted to compare themselves with was the US. But when I went to the students and youngsters, they were very keen on the comparison with India and the democracy and the pluralism and the critical voices and everything. But now we don't even have that.
Okay, so this is a time I'm going to open it up. There are a couple more themes that we can touch on, technology and climate. But yeah, so open house folks, आप लोग पहले इनको mic दीजिए. So students have, let's say, first call on your... Here, आगे. Sure. Can we have some water? आइए, बोलिए. Go ahead. On है शायद. हाँ. हो जाएगा आप बात कर लीजिए.
So one is on the rupee and who does it help? And the second question is?
Is how does the macroeconomic translate to the common man?
Yeah.
And that's happening right today.
What's happening here? Shall we take another question? Then we can try and get, especially if any questions around macroeconomic stuff. Yeah, go ahead with it. Yeah, please.
Hi, sir. I'm Shivani. I'm a PhD student here. I found some thoughts of yours on the power sector very useful. Could you elaborate on why do you think privatization is the way to go? In the context of, one, say, the cross-subsidy within most distribution utilities in India already reducing. We already have agricultural tariffs which are 80% of the cost of supply in many of the distribution utilities. Of course, this space is being taken up by government subsidy now. And with the electricity amendment bill, with the provision of cross-subsidy being ceasing to exist in the next 5 years, I'm wondering if mandates like this will bring in more efficiency, even when the state discoms remain public. Because I'm not sure whether experiments in India, whether there are many that have shown that private utilities can show success. In non-urban areas, distribution franchisees also, except Bhiwandi, have shown mixed outcomes. So just some elaboration and thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, so you got two technical questions then. Maybe you should respond. Something related? Yes. Chali, boli.
So you earlier spoke about
Just introduce yourself.
Haryana and Punjab. So I come from Punjab. So the question is, one of the things is that Haryana was able to structurally transform, whereas Punjab wasn't. We still do very well on many of the development indicators because of the green revolution. We had, highest GSDP, per capita GSDP for long. But now the thing is, like she mentioned about electricity subsidy and fertilizer subsidy. What can be the intervention for change? And who can lead that change? For example, like you mentioned, constraints on state action. And the thing that we also complained about is like the freight equalization levy that was, like, can be a lever of change if for industrial transformation of the state.
Okay, so you got round the clock industrial policy.
Then I'll.
Yeah. So first thing on the exchange rate, right? Firstly, I think what he was trying to say is, a declining exchange rate is not a sign that things are necessarily going bad, and that this might even be the necessary correction because we've had an external shock. Remember that a weaker rupee, it helps increase exports and helps reduce imports. So the economy generally becomes a bit more competitive, especially because we have such low inflation and the exchange rate doesn't lead to much higher domestic inflation. This will be good for our exports and for making the economy more competitive. So I think, there's a kind of aggregate sense in which this is right, and as a necessary response to some of the shocks that we're facing. But it's true that any such aggregate price that changes will have distributional impacts. There's no getting away from that, right? So for example, exchange rate, especially if it declines a lot, it could increase domestic inflation, for example, which might help the poor. So typically what central banks will then try and do is to mitigate those effects. They will probably try and raise interest rates to keep inflation down. So there is a kind of way in which these macro things translate into impact on particular sectors, and they can be and are taken into account generally when you formulate macroeconomic policy. But in this particular case, what the government is signaling, and the RBI, remember, the RBI is reduce interest rates today, and if you reduce interest rates, that may make the exchange rate go down even further, but what the government is saying is that that's not necessarily a bad thing because of what has happened internationally, and this is an adjustment that we perhaps need to have to make the economy more competitive. So that's the first thing. or let me take your question. We'll come to, maybe Devesh can take your broader macro question. It's kind of a philosophical question. See, remember two things. One, when I said a public sector monopoly is bad, that doesn't necessarily mean that there should be privatization. Right? What it means that there must be more competitive forces, which can happen in a number of different ways. There are very many models, and privatization is not the only one. But that doesn't mean we should exclude privatization from among the options as well. Now, the thing is that the point you said about, if we force these mandates, won't that help, right? So the government is thinking of trying to eliminate. It's something that we've been working on and recommending this as well. See, there are two problems with that, right? One, there's the central government can only exhort. The decision to actually give cross subsidies is with state governments. They nominally with state regulators, but basically state governments determine what the regulator has to do. So there's no guarantee that the cross subsidy will be eliminated because the central government says so, unless it backs it up with some very strong sticks, which may not happen. And therefore, if you're going to rely on that as the agent of change going forward, it's a very tricky and unreliable basis. Because remember, it's the cross-subsidy, it's the agricultural subsidies that leads to the cross-subsidy that makes the cost of power 100% more expensive than it should be. So those are the two things on that. Your question on Punjab and...
Punjab.
On the Punjab, as we were saying that, look, in Punjab, it is just crystal clear that the electricity subsidy, if you were to ask me what are the two worst policy distortions in India, it's the electricity subsidy and the fertilizer subsidy. They may have had a rationale once upon a time, but now they have, in the case of Punjab and the subsidy, A, it benefits the rich farmers. B, it's leading to a lot of disease, the fertilizer and the water overuse. 3, the water tables have shrunk in a way that's going to make water very thin. 4, it's actually leading to the overproduction of cereals, it's busting. Okay, one statistic. In the last, I think, 30 or 40 years, the Punjab government has never spent more than 5 to 10% of its total expenditure on development expenditure because of the subsidy. Over 30 years, it just had no resources. So the fiscal problem. Now, obviously the key problem is political, but if you think about it that these subsidies are mainly benefiting rich farmers, why can we don't have to go after subsidies going to poor farmers? It is politics, but it's also a failure of political imagination that does not come up with relatively, workable solutions for this kind of problem.
I'll just add, at different points of time, both Arvind and I have been advisors to the Punjab government, different political parties. I think we should also understand the role of the central government. The government's procurement policies, it's like a drug pusher. Today, if the central government says agriculture is a state subject, anyone wants to subsidize any farmer with whatever, procure whatever crop, it is completely up to the states. We will buy for the PDS from the market or from the states. You will see this problem going to go away very rapidly. Punjab today gets rents from army pensions because it has had the maximum number of people recruited way above its population share. It gets rents from remittances. It gets rents from the central government through procurement. Because of that, it can afford a level of consumption that is much higher than its productive capacity, which is, of course, then reduces pressures for change. This was a state that in the 70s was going to be India's leading state by far. Look at the way it has regressed. There is no better indicator, and we show this in our of a state's future than what its youth think about it. And the way a youth thinks about their future prospects is they vote with their feet and they leave. The two states where the states where we are seeing Bihar, West Bengal, and Punjab are three states where you have the maximum out-migration, because young people know much better than all the advisors of what the future looks like in the state. And yet the Punjab government, no matter what political party, has their heads completely in the sand, even though they are facing an ecological and I think an economic and political severe challenges.
So I think the way, one thing I would add to what Devesh is saying is that my own view on this is that the whole subsidy problem has to be tackled with cooperative federalism between the center and the states. You know, one possibility would be to say that, you know, the center could say that if you reduce the power subsidy, we will take, you know, corresponding action on some other subsidy. So you can do this jointly as well. So I think going forward, many of these, see, if you put all the burden on Punjab, it's probably politically unsustainable. If you put all the burden on the center will not do it. But what we need to come up with is more creative, cooperative federalism solutions for this problem. But that requires trust between the center and the states, and that at the moment is a bit elusive as well. Because the other thing, remember that, just to add, the other consequence of this subsidy and rice is the negative externality to other states because of the rice burning that happens. So actions in Punjab have consequences for, you know, at least the neighboring states, West UP, and therefore that's even more reason why you should have cooperative solutions between the state, Punjab, the state, and the center.
Okay, so two quick questions now from students, and then we can move on because we have to close.
Yeah. So, sir, I'm Kedar from Mahe. I'm glad that a lot of discussion happened on agriculture. So I want to know your, I want to know your opinion about the role of institution, particularly for shaping our growth. And here I want to give an example for agriculture. I think Karnataka is one of the leading, state where agriculture is doing extremely good. We have a lot of commodities we are exporting. But the problem comes here is that, with the privatization, where, we are not able to provide the institutional mechanism and where the three Nobel laureates work basically applicable. Still, we have a lot of...
Which three Nobel laureates?
Asimanglu, Asimanglu, or talk about Uller Williamson and other. How we can, improve our institutional mechanism. We will talk about subsidies and all. And what is the role of that, where we probably is basically failing, because we talk about reducing the subsidies and all, but then we're not talking about the R&D. We're not able to boost the productivity. Now, how one should strengthen our institutional framework, which is the need of the hour now.
Thanks. Last question, huh? Because we'll have to close.
दो क्वेश्चन है.
हाँ, बोलिए.
आपने बहुत सारे मुद्दों को टच किया है. उसमें एक है कि सोशल स्ट्रक्चर, जो भारत के ब्राह्मीण्स का स्ट्रक्चर है, पंचगौड़ पंचद्रविड़. नॉर्दर्न स्टेट में पंचगौड़ स्ट्रक्चर बहुत ज़्यादा अत्याचारी है और उसके अलग अलग डायमेंशंस हैं. दक्षिण में भी कास्टिज़म ख़त्म नहीं हुआ है, लेकिन रिमूव होने की कगार पर थोड़ा थोड़ा आ रहा है. तो उसमें क्या चैलेंजेस है? जैसे नॉर्थ इंडियन ब्राह्मीण्स ने वहाँ की भाषाओं को तक मार दिया है, हिंदी थोप दी है. ये सामाजिक वेपन है जो लोगों पर थोपा गया, वो उनकी भाषा नहीं है. बंगाली ब्राह्मणों को देखा जाए तो कॉलोनियल एरा में जो भद्र लोग थे उनके हाथ में जमींदारी थी, आज पॉलिटिकल पावर भी उन्हीं के हाथ में है. जैसे हम प्रोस्टिट्यूट एरिया में देखेंगे, मेजॉरिटी गर्ल्स बंगाल से आती है, लेकिन बंगाली पॉलिसी मेकर ये नहीं कहते कि हमारी है, ये बांग्लादेश से आई है. और गवर्नमेंट कहता है बांग्लादेश से आए, तब बंगाली कहते हैं ये हमारे नहीं है. तो ये स्ट्रक्चर क्यों नहीं टूट रहा है? ये स्ट्रक्चर हर जगह पर है. जैसे आपने कहा कि भारत के बहुत सारे लोग यूएस में जाते हैं, वहाँ पर कमाते हैं, सारे इलीट कास्ट से आते हैं, वो वही जाते हैं. और भारत के जो लोअर कास्ट लोग हैं, जो बॉम्बे अहमदाबाद में जाकर खट रहे हैं 12,000 पर. दूसरी तरफ जो लोअर कास्ट के लेबर्स है, केरला के हैं, उनकी डिमांड है जर्मनी में कि नर्सिंग बहुत अच्छी से आती है. तो ये बहुत अलग तरीके से सोसाइटी से रिलेटेड है. सेकंड है, आपने एग्रीकल्चर और जो सब्सिडाइज का बात किया है, तो मेजरली भारत की पॉलिटिक्स पर शुगर केन इंडस्ट्री और राइस इंडस्ट्री का दबदबा है। शुगर केन इंडस्ट्री में महाराष्ट्र में शरद पवार का डायरेक्टली नाम लेता हूँ, और राइस बेल्ट में पंजाब के जाटों का प्रभाव है। उसे तोड़ने के लिए कोशिश हुई अपनी अपनी पॉलिटिक्स को बचाते हुए। ये टूटने के लिए कौन से की चैलेंजेस है? क्योंकि ऑयल की कोई भी फार्मर लॉबी नहीं है भारत में, जबकि ऑयल की नीड है, पर्ल्स की नीड है, लेकिन उसकी फार्मर लॉबी से डरते हैं शुगर केन और राइस बेल्ट के किसान। तो इनमें क्या की चैलेंजेस हैं?
Okay, wonderful. So,
On that.
yeah. Sir, okay. Yeah, quick, because you guys have got to leave now also. Yeah, go ahead. आगे आ जाओ, हाँ.
So I was just, my name is Bijoy. I'm a PhD student. Reading your book, I was also reminded of Vinay Sitapathi's biography of Narasimha Rao, 1990 to 95, those years, because something was changing in those years. Both 73rd, 74th Amendment came through, and also initially in the 1950s, what the Nehruvian idea that was framing. In between, it seems that the narrative that both you present and generally it is presented is in a continuation. Those 5 years, if you could speak more specifically, did it change or did it fail? And also in relation to what Deng Xiaoping was doing in China. Is it the structure of the Indian state, certain processes, actors? What really happens? Do we need another LPG version 2.0 or these patchwork of, ये subsidy चालू करते हैं, इसको बंद करते हैं, this whole turning on off to see where we lead to?
Thanks. Okay, now you've got a full plate.
So I'll start and then you can. I mean, with your question, I'll begin with yours and just use this remark that apparently Deng Xiaoping was asked about, sorry, not Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai was asked what he thought of the French Revolution. He said it's too early to tell. So about the 90s, it's too early to tell. So maybe in our next book we might be able to. But Arvind will be able to answer that better. Look, on institutions, I worked a lot on that. We began worrying about this in the early 2000s. Now, there were efforts to improve, but it's very clear that in more recent years, there have been setbacks. You cannot separate the health of institutions from what is happening in wider politics. All you have to do is to look at the US, right? Which everyone said such strong institutions. Within 10 months, the destruction has been ways in which even in India, we have done much better, right? So, I think we had all been proud that at least India had set up good, what we call referee institutions. And referee institutions are institutions like the election, the commission, the Supreme Court, etc. But I think if the political class has power and is determined to use it and does not have a sense of self-restraint, there is simply no way, whatever institutional design you do, that it will last. That I am convinced. If the political class, the single biggest factor I think that makes the democracy work is that people in power have some deep sense of norms of self-restraint. If those are not there, anything and everything is possible. So I don't have a good answer to put it that. जो आपका क्वेश्चन है, if you don't mind, I'll speak in English. कि है?
हाँ, कोई बात नहीं, वो अंग्रेजी में जवाब देंगे, आपको समझ में आती है. हाँ, ठीक है. कोशिश कर लो भाई. हाँ, यूपी से हो.
यूपी के थे. So देखिए,
Yeah, he understands English. I know that.
साउथ में social movements जो हुए थे केरला में पहले, तमिलनाडु में जस्टिस पार्टी वगैरह, created a foundation on which democratic politics took place. North में social movements were much weaker. So the burden fell entirely on politics to transform society. So the incentives to capture power were much greater. So the changes that are coming more slowly, but they are coming. हमने ईस्ट यूपी में काम किया था, with the largest survey of Dalits on how their lives had changed in the past 30 years since liberalization. तो यूपी में, ईस्ट यूपी में एक फ्यूडल सिस्टम था, उसको बोलते थे हलवा. Halwa was always a Dalit, usually, because taking care of the bullocks was a dirty job. So ठाकुर जो थे हल नहीं छूते थे. फिर late 1970s, 80s में irrigation began to come to East UP. As irrigation came, double cropping began to happen. As double cropping began to happen, incomes rose for the Thakur to buy a tractor. Now a tractor, the Thakur was willing to farm on his own. It wasn't a dirty job. It was modern. Once the tractor came, his dependence and his incentive to hold on to the labor of the Dalit laborer dropped.
हाँ, जजमान पूरा ही उतर गया ना.
उसके बाद the Dalits began to migrate much more. They have begun to send back remittances, which means that Dalit households do not depend on the landlord for cash flow in lean times because they have insurance from the brother or uncle who is working outside. And there is huge social change happening. That doesn't mean it is equal, but it is much less unequal than it used to be. So what these large macro forces are doing are creating changes that are occurring parallel and sometimes independent of the politics that we are seeing.
But yeah, so I think, yeah.
One last thing on, on the question on the early 90s, whether it's... the thing is that, notice that even that ideology of that, the 1990s, has now again, world over has come under challenge. So in a different way of saying, wait for another 200 years to see the effect of the French Revolution, is to see that there are, inevitably going to be ups and downs, both in ideology and in structures and things. And I think, therefore, even if you look at even the last 5 years, to me, here's one of the ironies, right? That the period between 1990 and 2015, between 1980 2015, if you look at overall Indian performance, not just at the macro level, but also in terms of poverty reduction, the improvement in social structure and everything, that happened because India opened up, right? We often say that we should learn from our mistakes. But in India, we haven't learned from our successes because that era, which produced so much positive things, not just did this government repudiate and went back to closing the economy, the manifesto of the Congress party does not mention anything anywhere about, how do we increase opportunities, how do we increase investment. It's also how the Congress party itself treated. Yeah. So the point is that, if we're not even going to learn from our successes, then I think, things are looking pretty bad regardless of what happens everywhere. See, the thing about, this whole impact of openness, one of the things we show in the book is that even at the state level, the states that did well, some of it was because of the social reform movements that happened early. Narayana Guru in Kerala, Justice Party, which of course changed society, led to better human capital outcomes, which then led to better other outcomes. But the other commonality of all the successful states is that they were the most exposed to globalization, either in the form of manufacturing, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, services, Karnataka, or in the case of Kerala, through labor, export of labor. So that's another lesson. So the broader point, coming back to what Devesh said, is that there are two ways of changing society. I'm speaking very crudely. One is through political action and mobilization, right? And that has to happen. And in some ways, you could argue that that did happen in the 80s and 90s in India in different forms. Inadequate, but political. So you can have political mobilization, social mobilization that leads to that. Or in addition, you could have economic change that facilitates those things, which is what the example from Eastern UP. So we have to act on all fronts, but I think the key point is that what you identified about the persistence of power and related to caste and hierarchy is a very good one. The last thing I will say about is that, see, the other imbalance is the gender imbalance, right, in India. If you look at Bangladesh, for example, 25 years ago, all the social indicators for women were not great. But 25 years of labor-intensive manufacturing in Bangladesh, all kinds of indicators on social incomes and gender indicators have improved because women got power, women got opportunities, women got income, women got agency, and that transformed everything.
Actually, if I can just one last thing.
Quick, this thing before they have to leave at the moment.
Yeah. So, which is your point on Indian migrants to the US upper caste. That was the case because upper caste had access to higher education earlier, and migration to the US was based on higher education. However, as higher education has broadened, we are seeing much more of the middle class, many more Dalits in the US, still not comparable to the upper caste, but relative to the past, it's really changing.
Just a quick comment, we should close here. One of the interesting things is you talked about two ways of change, political mobilization, etc., and economic. Now people forget that Ambedkar is originally an economist, fine? So we have to re-examine Ambedkar's position on this because he talked about both those things and only some part of that is actually privileged, which is the social mobilization started. I think we have to close now because you folks have exam week next week and you've got to go back and do work. Last question? Yeah, some people can stay if they want to do something. Yes. So, जिनको किताब वगैरह साइन करानी है वो भी आ जाए. हाँ. अंतिम प्रश्न. Go ahead. No, just yeah. Go. Yeah, no, you use the mic because we are streaming.
It's taking a while.
So, yeah. Go ahead. Mic's with you. You can talk.
Hi, this is Anushri. I really like the take on your demography, but I have a kind of clarificatory your views, further views on demographic front. Since you're saying about three, at least minimum of two to three ways of demographies that would turn out in the next 35, 40 years, which also, if there exists, continues to exist, migration and migration with high skilled, then states with having jobs requiring high skilled labor could probably catch up, and we could see some sort of a long-term opportunities. But if the migration is led by low skilled labor and with technology being in forefront in next 35 years, where low skilled probably jobs don't exist or less cease to exist, then what sort of changes should the state or agency should think so that in the next 45 years, even with migration and three different ways of demography that we would probably have, still we would be able to sustain ourselves to be wherever we are?
Very good.
Aromar, I have, very related question, but also when you're saying 1/6 of humanity and many other things, we also have 1/5 of informal economy workers in India, and we think it's actually 1/3 and not 1/5. It's about policy response, but also the next 20, 30 years, we're talking about jobs. But in so many years, we've not really managed to create jobs. So is it a question of work, and how do we make that work decent, or is it about jobs, and what should be the policy response? I concur with the question before this.
So actually, the migration that I think we really would be really much more equalizing is low-skill migration. And that, by the way, will continue to happen much more, because worldwide, it's the so-called 3D jobs, right? The dirty, the demanding and dangerous jobs that Malayalis do not want to work in agriculture and construction today, period. Because they are higher income, just as Americans don't want to work on those jobs. That's why Central Americans and Mexicans come and do those jobs. That's why agriculture in Japan now, despite being against immigration, you're having that. Korea, Italy. So you will have a demand for these core sectors like agriculture and construction and restaurant workers, household labor. These are classic migrant jobs. Locals are much more reluctant to do it when incomes rise above a certain level. And in that sense, it's an equalizing force because you get labor coming from the poorer states.
I think going forward, the pace of the differential demography fertility transition is going to be one determinant of how much migration happens. But the other thing, just reinforcing what is going to be, if growth performance across the states continues to be as divergent, then the migration pressures will only be higher. Because, by definition, more opportunities elsewhere. So, therefore, those are going to be and so if this unequal growth and, the unequal fertility pace continues, we're going to have much more migration, which is a good thing. Because remember, it is not only that they get jobs, but they send back remittances back home. So that my own view is that if you measure regional kind of divergence in GDP terms, it overstates probably the divergence in consumption, because that's the equalizing force. They come here, they earn more than they would have otherwise, and they send back money, which is what becomes the force for convergence. Now, the problem, of course, is that migration cannot be open-ended, because already we are saying, so many states are saying, no, remember, Tamil Nadu government has said, and Telangana government, I think Andhra, we must have more babies. So already you can see the reaction to immigration that's happening, right? And as I keep saying, we should never forget that Bal Thackeray and the Shiv Sena were anti-Tamil before they were anti-Muslim. You should remember that. So and this is true internationally, it's an iron law that most societies are not able to handle migration more than a certain level. That's just a reality of identity-based, whatever nationhood or whatever you have. And so we need to be thinking about what are sustainable levels of migration. And of course, the poorer regions have to start improving. Otherwise, this trend will continue to unsustainable levels. So multiple action has to be seen on multiple fronts.
Good. So I'm going to close here for you guys to go back. There are few people who may want to come to have books signed. Other people have questions. So जिन लोगों ने जाना है, आप लोग निकलिए जरा. And the rest of us. Thank you. Yeah, those of you who want books and the other questions here, you can. Yeah. So these.
Bring the books here.
That'll be great. Yeah. Sudhir, go ahead.
There is Willing to turn back?
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.